So sometimes people ask about the orange shirts, Orange Shirt Day. And, you know, that's one day out of the year. Um, and now, because of the recent discovery or maybe awareness of the grave sites, unmarked graves of the children who passed and perished in those residential schools, you see a lot more people wearing those orange shirts and the Every Child Matters shirts. And so, so I want to talk a little bit about this this residential school thing. The the thing is that I want to go back a little ways, a couple hundred years or so, maybe 300 or 400 years, because almost, well, absolutely, especially the Spanish and the French people, when their ships would come across the ocean, by some kind of law, those ships had to have a priest on board. They had to have those priests bringing the comfort of the church with them on these perilous voyages to, you know, and they were pretty sure at the time that they first started doing that, that at some point the ship would arrive at the edge of the earth and they would plunge off and fall into whatever. I don't know where they were supposed to end up. Anyway, there was this flat earth thing going on. So anyway, these priests had to be on board the ships. And they were intended to maintain the morality of the sailors on these ships. They were supposed to keep them from doing things that that would result in them going to hell if they should perish. So that's why the priests were there. So then when they started to move around on this continent, North and South America, especially the Jesuits who traveled with the French people. So I'm gonna sort of concentrate on those guys. They used to write letters. They called them the Jesuit Relations. Those notes that they would write about everything they observed while they were traveling with these French voyageurs. And so they had established relationships with the people, with the Anishinaabe people, and so they would stay in their villages while they were traveling, both for safety and for comfort, I suppose. And so some of their writing was about what they observed in the villages. And one of the Jesuits who was writing about his stay in this village talked about the way the children would be allowed to run freely. They were allowed to move freely around in their community, that they were able to eat anywhere they wanted to eat. And they would sit with any family they wanted to sit with. They were curious about everything that was going on around them, and they would check everything out, and they would they would ask endless questions, I guess. I don't know all the details, but so this Jesuit priest was writing about um, this freedom that the children had, and his intention, his belief was that when they would make inroads into the communities amongst these people, that they would teach them how to discipline the children, that they would find ways to make sure that the children always knew that to spare the rod would spoil the child, and they would teach their parents how to punish these kids for whatever sort of transgressions they thought they could see. And so the idea was that the well, that they would have enough influence over the community, over the parents and the families, that they would be allowed to beat these children into submission, to discipline them somehow. And so that was an intention that they had. And so these priests began their missionary work, and they made various inroads into our communities. And sometimes they would actually achieve what they called conversion to Christianity amongst the people. And so the influence of the missionary over these families, over their converts, was intended to be total. They wanted complete conversion. And so if a man converted, they wanted to see that his partner, his wife, was also converted, and their children would follow them into this conversion. And that was without really recognizing that each of the people they were talking about in this family, each of them had free will. And so just because one person converted didn't mean the second one would do it or their family would do it. So of course, truly influence the future of their children, of the children of these converts. Some of the missionaries got the idea to make schools where the children would be influenced by their teachings from the Bible. And so they built schools, and they invited the children of their converts to go to the school. And so sometimes the children would go to the school, and they would be expected to stay there. And the first thing they would do is cut off their hair and take away their clothes and make them wear wool pants and wool shirts and hard shoes. And sometimes that would be enough for the kids to say, "No, I'm out of here." But inevitably, these children would leave, because most of it, I think, was to do with loneliness and feeling isolated from their families. But also, the food was terrible. There wasn't anything about the food that they really enjoyed. So they would leave and go home. And so it was a miserable failure to build these schools. And this was in the late 1700s and early 1800s that they first started building those schools and offering them to the families of converted Indians. Well, after, at the time of the treaty signing, um, part of the treaty process was to negotiate the conditions of the treaty. And one of the conditions that was included in the Robinson, Huron, and Superior treaties was um, the provision for education, for schools. And because our ancestors knew that we would need to know something about these people who were coming to their land. And so the school system or the school itself would be a way to teach the children who they were dealing with. At the time of the creation or the Confederation of Canada came about, Sir John A. Macdonald had the notion that he had an Indian problem. And his problem was that he didn't want to have to deal with the administration of the treaties that was transferred as part of Canada's responsibility from Queen Victoria. So he got the transfer of administrative responsibility through the British North America Act. And so, of course, John A. Macdonald is famous for saying that they would have to educate the Indian out of the child. And so began the whole creation of the residential school system. And it became a system because the government would fund the churches and the missionary groups to build schools and to take the children and educate them in the schools. And so the government paid the churches to do this. And they weren't working for quality of education. They were working to ensure that the child would be away from the influence of his parents or her parents. And so the parents would not influence the child's growth and development. And so they would be isolated from their families. When that came around, from the Church of England point of view, was that they had something over there called poorhouses. And people who were poor or living in poverty were punished by being sent to these poorhouses where they would work for their room and board. And so on that premise, they created their schools. So a lot of the time, the children were laboring to take care of animals and farms and gardens and crops and all the rest of that stuff at the school where they were supposed to be learning how to become good Canadians. And one of my friends said she was in a residential school, and I was talking to her when I was a student in high school. So that was a good long time ago when I was in my teens. And she said that she spent so much time on her knees while she was in the residential school at Spanish that when she came out of there, she said that when she was in the school, she spent time on her knees and she was either praying or she was washing and scrubbing the floor. So when she came out of there, she swore she would never be down on her knees ever again. And so the first thing she said, she said the first thing I ever bought myself when I was setting up my house, she says, I bought a long handled mop. She's never been on her knees again. So that was her way of dealing um with the, I think it was a punishment oriented system. She also said that when she was a young girl in those schools, in that school, that she worked in the kitchen a lot, and they used to make uh, fancy dinners, roast beef, and mashed potatoes and gravy and vegetables on the side with pickles and all kinds of condiments and even Yorkshire pudding. And they would bake bread, and it would be just wonderful. Um, but it was only for the teachers and the nuns and the priests. She would go back from the kitchen to her meal of very thin, watery soup that she would eat. And she said when sometimes the little ones in the dormitory would be so hungry they would cry through the night because they were so hungry. And so she and the girls would sneak these little kids down to the pantry and they would steal food. They would steal food from the teacher's pantry, not from their own. And she said, we knew where the good food was. But she said, that place taught me how to steal. And she said, and it was one of the things that she would never do after she left there. So two things, she would never get on her knees and she would never have to steal again. But her children never went to bed hungry. She worked hard, her and her husband. They raised really wonderful, wonderful family. And um, and they never did anything to harm anybody. And that kind of determination doesn't come from um, the kind of education she was living through as a child. It comes from being able to think what would be a better life. So one of the things that another one of my friends who was in Spanish um, residential school, um, she showed me where it was. We were coming home from ceremonies one time, and we went down to the grounds where the residential school used to be when we were coming back through Spanish. And she showed me where the buildings were. And she was so surprised to find that one of the buildings was gone altogether. And they also had a graveyard there. I met over the years many people who were residential school survivors. And I never heard even one of them talk about um, the residential school as being a good place to be. They always questioned why it was that people who hated children would want to be around them. Why, if you hate Indians, would you want to be around them? Why, if you hate children, you would want to be around them? It made no sense to them as children, and it made even less sense to them when they were adults. So there are many horrific stories told by residential school survivors. And um, one of the things that I have learned is um, that there was never any need to exaggerate the horrific conditions of those schools. Because I know um, that there's absolutely no excuse for the way those children were treated. None. And so um, when people wear those shirts, wear the orange t-shirt, they are they're silently giving um, children who couldn't say anything, giving them voice. And they're reminding Canadians that every child really does matter. You know, there's there's no excuse that I know of that can be given for treating children so badly. And and I really do encourage young people to keep in mind those ones who never made it home, and how much it must have hurt their parents and their families never to see them again, and to have people simply tell them, we don't know what happened to your child. I don't I don't think that the level of ignorance of that situation that exists today um, could lead to true reconciliation. I do know that there are people in Canada who are trying really hard to find out the truth and to stand up for the children who were lost and the ones who have been left harmed by that loss. And is this is just a small part of an understanding of the Orange Shirt Day. I I really believe that these children who were lost um, to our families and communities, I really believe um, that when we have our memorial feasts and when we have um, memorial celebrations like round dances that are part of the memorials, um, that we should bear in mind those children who never came home. that those ones whose name was never called to come and join a memorial feast, we want to call them. We want to invite them to come and feast with us, and to know that they were loved, and they were cared about, and that if we had been able to do more for them, that would have been done. So, so maybe that's part of the reason why we carry those red shirt or those orange shirts. It's kind of along the same line as the red dresses for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We have a lot. We have a lot of loss to contend with, and it's a challenge sometimes. But but we're beginning to make the point. And so the Residential School Survivors Day, um, sooner or later, um, that will be a day of memorializing the loss of those children and the loss of the childhoods of so many other children who, in fact, did make it home, but suffered consequences as well. So all of that ties together. To my mind, it ties together that that our relatives suffered, and we need to acknowledge their suffering. And so that means wear an orange shirt. Um, Seems like a little bit of a small thing, but it's a big thing for someone who has lived their life in silence about how they suffered. So that's what I wanted to say about that. I'm sure there are many other ways to talk about these things, and maybe amongst your friends, um, there will be other thoughts that you can share with each other and determine for yourself what the orange shirt day means to you. And it's important that that you give it meaning, you give it substance in your own life. Yeah, you got command them. Okay, Caitlin, I think I'm done with that too. Hello?